Can art train us to be more empathic? Through the dark and ominous lens of fiction, can artistic works in the realm of horror actually help us to understand the struggles of other people? Can it help us to better understand our own struggles? Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. This is the fourth video in a series of installments relating to the enigmatic web series Petscop. In previous installments, I went over the 10 videos that presently comprise the Petscop series. In this video, I'll be tying up a few loose ends with respect to a number of points brought up in previous videos. So if you haven't seen my previous installments, please check those out prior to watching this video. In addition, I'll be discussing some new developments in the Petscop universe. And finally, I will attempt to formulate a cohesive interpretation of the series in its present state. But listen, the key word here is interpretation. The purpose of my videos is always to promote discussion. I don't have a monopoly on the subject matter, and I don't have an inside track on the meaning of this elusive art project. That is one of the great things about art. It's open to interpretation and often generates a wide and diverse array of them. I'm of the opinion that the greatest pieces of art are the ones that bring about lively discussion and, at times, heated disagreements. Now, despite what I've just said, I do believe that some interpretations of Petscop are more valid than others. If it were otherwise, I wouldn't be making these videos. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Petscop means whatever you want it to mean. I'm just saying, don't take my ideas about the series as the holy gospel. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm asking you to let me make the case for my understanding of the work. My intent here is not to assert some grand unifying theory that answers all of the lingering questions surrounding the series. Rather, I would like to offer a way to think about Petscop that you have perhaps not yet considered. I don't want you to ever finish watching one of my videos and think, well, that's it, he's got it all figured out, case closed. As always, I want this to be a conversation. I love hearing your observations and criticisms. This is, of course, provided that they are civil and constructive, or sufficiently humorous so as to make up for the lack of the first two criteria. So, if you have some thoughts to offer, please do so in the comments, or better yet, make your own video. I know I've said it before, but I want to reiterate it here. Your feedback is invaluable. Thus far, I've dedicated 3 videos to talking about this series. For what it's worth, I have devoted more time to unpacking Petscop than I have any other topic previously covered on my channel. Let me tell you why that is. Petscop is one of the most ingenious pieces of art that I've ever come across. It plays with medium and genre in a way that both undermines these conceits, and it does so while still managing to service the narrative. And moreover, it does so while eliciting a sense of mystery and, for me at least, a deep, uncanny sense of horror. With each passing moment in the series, it raises probing and, at times, uncomfortable questions that continue to linger, even now, months after the 10th video was released. Perhaps most importantly, I believe that Petscop raises some poignant and critical observations about the human condition. And the more I've combed over these videos, the more I've realized just how inventive and subtly brilliant the series really is. I'm not someone who gushes over every little thing. Petscop is extraordinary. So I've already covered videos 1 through 10, and I've attempted to do so point by point. That is to say, I've tried to accurately catalog the events of Petscop. Occasionally, I've paused to note certain peculiarities and, at times, account for various ambiguities. And at this point, I'm thoroughly convinced that ambiguity is an inherent part of the work itself. This is perhaps best illustrated by a certain example from the game. As I've previously noted, portmanteaus seem to be a reoccurring theme throughout Petscop. This is strikingly evident in the case of 2 pets, Tonith and Randus. It is implied that these 2 creatures fuse together to produce a pet called Ronith. It is critically important to the work that Ronith is unattainable. The pet floats over our protagonist, always just out of reach. So too is concrete, or perhaps it would be better to say transcendent, meaning unattainable, in this series. It is ambiguous on critical levels of understanding, and that is an inherent feature of the work itself. The experience of watching Petscop is a bit like trying to piece together a broken vase with some critical pieces missing. I think, in some sense, the work is setting the viewer up to fail in this regard. but it does so for good structural reasons. I'll touch back on this later in the video, but I want you to keep it in mind as I cover these new developments. On June 8th, just over a week after the 10th video was posted, the profile picture on the Petscop YouTube channel changed from a shot of Paul's avatar to a vacant area of the game. Specifically, I believe it's the tunnel first seen in video 2, and more predominantly towards the beginning of video 8. It's the tunnel cars come rushing out of, the very same tunnel from which we witnessed the emergence of Marvin, or at least the character we assume to be Marvin. Note that the current icon appears to be the exact same position previously featured. The only distinction is that now Paul's avatar is missing. It's gone. Keep this in mind because it's going to come up again in a minute. In late June, the About section of the YouTube channel was added. It reads as follows. Rainer gave us this gift on Christmas, 1997 and 2000. It was the single longest day of our lives. We were all certain he was dead at the time. He had been missing since June 1997 and 2000. We're not as concerned about these things now. Please enjoy the recordings. We do. And then there's a smiley face, which is really quite creepy considering the context. Note the inclusion of the name Rainer in this description. We previously came across this name in the 9th video on the Note and Cares room. It was signed Rainer, Newmaker. Further recall that the note contains some rather disconcerting tidbits of information. The speaker, Rainer, seems to have some strange notions about an occurrence that took place way back in 1977. It's not all that clear who exactly this note is intended for. It repeatedly addresses the reader as you, so it would be reasonable to assume that it was meant for a specific person. Paul assumes as much regarding the previous note in video 3. And, as Paul says, he did find this game with a note that said, quote, for you. Now, in the latest note, the speaker suggests that you accompanied your friend to a windmill and took a picture with them, after which both your friend, as well as the windmill itself, mysteriously disappeared. After this, you married your friend's sister, and your friend was, quote, reborn as your daughter. The speaker claims to have found evidence to support this claim. In an accusatory manner, the speaker asks, what did you do? Now, in this updated channel description, the name Rainer appears in quotes. This would seem to indicate that Rainer is not actually the character's name, but rather a moniker that he may have adopted. And why would this Rainer adopt a name that is distinct from his given name? Well, there are many potential reasons, but my best guess in this case is that the person calls himself Rainer in order to maintain anonymity. This is because the speaker in this note, this Rainer, seems to be making a serious accusation. And, well, I hope I don't need to explain why it would behoove the speaker to remain anonymous if indeed some version of these accusations is even remotely accurate. So why did he pick this specific name? Why Rainer? Perhaps this person is just a fan of a certain Austrian poet. More on that later. This tendency to put words in quotations is one peculiar feature of the text, one that seems to correlate with other aspects of the narrative, specifically with respect to the individuals who ostensibly run the YouTube channel. Keep in mind that I'm speaking in reference to the fictional universe of Petscop, not the creators themselves. All of this should be considered through the veil of fiction. So, with that in mind, let's talk about these people who run the channel. Let's go ahead and call them the proprietors. And that's plural. After all, they consistently refer to themselves as we. There would seem to be more than one person running this channel. So I think that I've established that while this new description in the About section is short, it is rather telling. And from this newly available information, we can draw certain connections to the videos. The only previous instance in which the audience is directly addressed by the proprietors is in video 7, when we are dutifully informed about the censors. Notably, this message also contains certain words in quotes. Specifically, the word censor appears in quotations. In addition, future items to be censored also appear in quotes. A big present with a sticker on it, something on a wall in a black house, and written on a chalkboard. The fact that these phrases appear to be in quotes would seem to imply that it is not the proprietor's choice of words exactly, but rather someone else's. It would perhaps even stand to reason that the proprietors are quoting someone they know in order to get that person's attention, or perhaps even taunt them. Perhaps they're quoting this so-called Rainer. At face value, Rainer's accusation sounds somewhat outlandish. According to Rainer, someone ominously disappeared along with a windmill, and that very same someone was later reborn, as his note says. I don't know about you, but if someone made this claim to me in literal terms, I would venture to guess that they were in desperate need of psychiatric attention. Let's also not forget the previous note from video 3, in which the speaker vows to shoot someone in the head. Assuming that this note was also written by Rainer, it would appear that he is a pretty nefarious character himself. But maybe we're not supposed to take these claims literally. Maybe this Rainer is speaking in figurative terms. After all, he has adopted a poetic pseudonym. It's not exactly a huge leap in reason to theorize that he's got a flair for metaphoric language. Perhaps this note contains a coded message, sufficiently obscure for anyone who might happen upon the game to miss its meaning and context entirely. But, as Paul previously speculates in video 3, the hidden portion of the game could be intended for someone, and that certain someone might know exactly what this Rainer is talking about. The horrifying catch here is that the someone in question might actually be one of the people running the Petscop YouTube channel. Or at least, that's what I suspect. So let's try to contextualize these channel updates. Paul's avatar went missing in early June, shortly after the 10th video was uploaded. And now, we have a channel description indicating the character known as Rainer went missing, quote, since June 1997 and 2000. The confounding factor here is that if we follow the logic of this statement, this Rainer appears to have gone missing on 2 separate occasions, 3 years apart. Let's put that quandary aside for now because there's a distinct parallel occurring here. Paul's avatar went missing in early June, shortly after the 10th video was uploaded. Now, we have the proprietors of the channel claiming that Rainer also went missing in the month of June. Let's not forget that Paul is addressed as the Newmaker in the game itself. Rainer also seems to have ascribed himself with that title. Remember, the note in Care's room is signed Rainer, Newmaker. Further note that Paul's avatar went missing in June of 2017, exactly 20 years after the supposed disappearance of this Rainer. This connection between Paul and Rainer is stark and somewhat foreboding considering the circumstances, i.e., that they both seem to have disappeared. Here are 2 essential things we know about Rainer based on both the channel description and the note. Rainer made an accusation, and he went missing. It's not exactly a stretch of the imagination to assume these 2 details are somehow linked. And now, it seems that Paul has mysteriously disappeared. Perhaps he learned some compromising information about the accused party in Rainer's note, and said knowledge led to Paul being considered a liability for said party. Let's further note another conspicuous detail in the channel description. The proprietors state that they received the game from Rainer on Christmas, and that they were certain he was dead at the time. Recall that Rainer went missing in the month of June, 6 months prior to Christmas. Imagine the proprietor's surprise to receive a gift from someone they had assumed to be dead. And now, think about the contents of the game itself. It's not exactly a happy surprise, is it? After all, Rainer made a very serious accusation in the game. Was Rainer accusing one of the proprietors of a certain heinous act? Did they make someone disappear? Let's call to mind the proprietor's remark about having received the game on Christmas. They said, quote, "It was the single longest day of our lives." And of course, that would be the reaction of someone who has committed horrible deeds after having been confronted by someone with specific knowledge of said deeds, wouldn't it? Why were the proprietors of the YouTube channel so certain that Rainer was dead? Did they make him disappear? At the end of the note, they say, quote, "We're not as concerned about these things now." This comment could imply that the proprietors have been assured of Rainer's death since receiving the game on Christmas. I'd like to make the argument that Rainer somehow managed to send this video game in the event of his disappearance. It operates as something of a death switch, if you will. I believe that the video game is essentially Rainer's account of a terrible crime. In that case, imagine the perpetrators of said crime gradually coming to realize that a certain someone is onto them, and that certain someone has evidence to prove their guilt. But if that's the case, how does Paul fit into all this exactly? I'll revisit that question soon enough. But first, onto a more recent development that I need to address before moving forward. In the second installment of my analysis, I said it was extremely unlikely that any legitimate Petscop material would emerge from any source other than the Petscop YouTube channel. This was in response to multiple so-called game-jacking attempts. But I also mentioned the possibility that perhaps a Petscop-related website does exist, and maybe it just hasn't been discovered. Recall that, according to Paul, a website was explicitly mentioned on the note that accompanied the game. Interestingly, the note is dated June 13th, 1997, and June 1997 is one of the dates mentioned in reference to Rayner's disappearance. The note says, quote, "Please go to my website on the sticker." Recall that the message about the censors also mentions, quote, "a big present with a sticker on it." Now, in video 9, Paul does in fact come across a big present with a sticker on it, and the contents of that present are censored. Moreover, the text on the sticker is, as best I can tell, totally illegible. No one can figure out what it says. But regardless, these few details have driven a number of Petscop aficionados to seek out a website that is related to the project. And I just want to state right off the bat that I don't think this is totally senseless, given these previously mentioned details. Anyway, let's get to the meat of this discussion. A certain website was recently discovered, but that finding might prove to be a tad misleading. I'm going to do my very best to responsibly explain the subsequent events that take place after this discovery. I should start off with a bit of a disclaimer here. I do not condone harassing people, nor do I condone doxing anyone who wishes to keep their identity private. Don't do it. And that's all the moralizing I'm going to do on the matter. You're ultimately responsible for your own actions. So, don't be a dingus. Use your head. With this in mind, I will be discussing the aforementioned website. However, I will not be displaying the website's name, nor will I be giving away any identifying information that might further compromise anyone's privacy. And I hope you understand why I'm now requesting that you please refrain from explicitly naming this website, if you in fact know the website I'm referencing, in any discussions that may subsequently occur in the comments for this video. I'll delete any comments that do so because we really have no way of knowing if this website is connected to the project. For now, it would suffice to say that the website in question is purportedly a resource to help people deal with loss, such as, for instance, the death of a loved one. However, due to the website's name along with a few other conspicuous details, certain people in the Petscop community thought it might be linked to everybody's favorite video game from 1997. And I can't necessarily blame anyone for that. For a series that is, in part, defined by its numerous and rather cryptic references, it doesn't seem entirely far-fetched to try and draw a few connections here. So let's talk about this website. Again, I'm going to be speaking about it in broad, somewhat vague terms, because I don't want to direct any undue attention there if, in fact, it has nothing to do with Petscop. But I do want to relay some general findings. Using the Wayback Machine, we can discern a few important pieces of information. Primarily, it should be noted that the site was mainly active for a period of time between 1998 and 2013. Based on snapshots from the Wayback Machine, it is clear that the site offered bits of advice and philosophical wisdom aimed at helping people deal with loss, such as the death of a loved one. And it has done so for decades. However, as you can see here, there's a noticeable gap between 2013 and 2017. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the site was inactive over the course of that entire period. It just means that no snapshots were taken during that time. A snapshot from February 27, 2017 displays an empty page. It shows only the following message: error, page cannot be displayed. Please contact your service provider for more details. This is the very first snapshot available for this year. This message would appear to indicate that, at this time, the domain was not properly set up to display the website in question, hence the error message. However, the very next snapshot, taken on May 23rd, reveals a fully functional website. So it is interesting that this website appeared to be inactive at least for some indeterminate period of time over the past several years. And it's also interesting that the first snapshot of a functional website in recent years happens to occur around the same time the 10th Petscop video was posted. But alas, this is all highly circumstantial. Here's another circumstantial tidbit of information. The website references Rainer Marie Rilke, the aforementioned Austrian poet from whom I speculate our Rainer has gotten his moniker. I was actually planning on bringing up Rilke prior to this whole website incident because a lot of the themes of his work, specifically his letters to a young poet, seem to be relevant in relation to Petscop. His letters might even serve as a type of key that's useful for interpreting the meaning of Petscop. And since Rainer is a somewhat idiomatic name, I mean, it's certainly not common here in the US, I don't think it's unreasonable to associate Rainer, the Petscop character, with Rainer Marie Rilke, perhaps the most notable person with that name. Anyway, the website references a bit of advice Rilke once gave to an aspiring poet. Rilke told him to, quote, live the questions. Here's the full quote. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. This is a bit of advice that may, upon first reading, sound a bit woo-woo. That is to say, deep and spiritual sounding, but ultimately lacking in substance. I think, however, the more life experience one has, the more this idea of living the questions will resonate. Personally, I think there's a lot of wisdom in this sentiment. Petscop certainly raises many questions, and I think it's fair to say that some of these questions are existential in nature. So, are we to stop looking for answers and live the questions, as Rilke suggests? What does it mean exactly to live the questions? I'll touch back on certain thematic connections in relation to Rilke's work later in the video. For now, think about this notion of living the questions in relation to the puzzle elements of Petscop. Think about how, perhaps, in this quest for answers, we might just be missing the forest for the trees. A day or so after the website was discovered, the following error message appeared on the bottom of the page. This series of numbers is code, specifically ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange. When decoded, the message reads as follows: Garalina. If you recall, Garalina is the name of the company that purportedly developed the game Petscop. Ostensibly, this would appear to link the website in question to Petscop itself. A post in the subreddit called attention to this website, and many people flocked to it in an attempt to search for possible clues. Subsequently, their contact form was barraged with messages. Some people ventured to guess that the site's contact page might operate in some way akin to the tool in Petscop. That is to say, a prompt for which participants could ask certain questions. And perhaps if the right question was asked, the creators would in turn release more videos and thus allow the story to move forward. That was some people's thinking anyway. Another ASCII code was later found in the website's source code. It translates to, quote, world not ready. So make of that what you will. It's important to note that these two ASCII codes have since been removed. They remain on the website for a few days. So how do we account for the appearance of these codes? Well, I'll start off by saying that there's a distinct possibility that this website was hacked. Now, there's not really any available evidence that would confirm this, but websites get hacked all the time, and considering the number of game-jacking attempts that have occurred in the past, it makes sense to proceed with a healthy sense of skepticism here. So keep that possibility in the back of your mind as you follow me through this line of inquiry. The question to ask at this point would be this: could there be an in-universe justification for the appearance of these ASCII codes? Do these coded messages make sense in the context of the story being told? Well, maybe. I've already mentioned the possibility that this Rainer is speaking in a coded language in order to signal something to the accused party in his note, though admittedly, that is a highly speculative idea. And in fairness, the project has not employed codes of this nature in the past. In that sense, they are anomalies with respect to the creator's established patterns. A day later, on September 11, 2017, the contact form was replaced with the following message. Due to a recent influx of inappropriate messages, the contact form has been disabled until a CAPTCHA can be installed. Sorry for the inconvenience. CAPTCHA is a short test employed to determine if a user is human. It's used to stop spam and halt the extraction of data by automated programs, i.e. bots. The application has been described as a sort of reverse Turing test. Now, if you don't know what the Turing test is, look it up, because it's an interesting subject, but it's one that is beyond the scope of this video. It would suffice to say that, traditionally, a Turing test has a human judge and a computer subject. In the case of a CAPTCHA application, it's the other way around. The computer is the judge, and the human is the would-be subject. Whereas in the case of the Turing test, judges have to determine whether or not the party they're communicating with is indistinguishable from a human intelligence. A CAPTCHA is merely employed to catch automated spam and data extraction bots. CAPTCHA applications typically work by presenting the subject with a series of distorted numbers and letters. There's usually a slight gradient to the background color. These qualities sufficiently obscure the characters, hindering any automated programs from moving forward. But humans can generally identify the characters. Interestingly, the most common type of CAPTCHA was first developed in 1997. Now, back to the website. Notably, the text from the contact page spells the term CAPTCHA with a K instead of a C, which is a far more common spelling. After all, the term is actually an acronym. It stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test, to tell computers and humans apart. It's a long and elaborate acronym. But the point here is that spelling the term with a K is simply inaccurate, though it does seem to be a somewhat common misspelling. Interestingly, if you Google the term CAPTCHA with a K, an entry from Urban Dictionary is one of the first few things to come up. CAPTCHA, another word for gotcha. The entry relies on the word gotcha in the sense that one comprehends whatever point is being made. It's interchangeable with the phrase, I understand. Of course, there's another context in which this word gotcha is used, and that's in the context of a prank. Just something to keep in mind. Here's another interesting tidbit of information. This Urban Dictionary entry was written by a person named Paul. Having said that, it appears to have been written in 2007. About a week later, a functional CAPTCHA was added to the website's contact page. And frankly, this makes no sense from the perspective of a website administrator, considering the circumstances. CAPTCHA is an application commonly used to stop spam bots, but that's not what's happening in this instance. Bots aren't the problem. People are. If the purpose of this CAPTCHA application is to stop all the inappropriate messages from Petscop fans, well, that's not going to be effective. People can pass a CAPTCHA test. That's the whole point of it. Of course, it's entirely possible that the administrator of this website is just not all that savvy when it comes to these sorts of things. Here's one reasonable interpretation of this scenario. The person who runs the website was barraged with what they perceived to be a bunch of totally confounding and, yes, inappropriate messages. Just imagine this person's reaction to ominous and totally out of left field questions like, who is Michael? Or remember being born? They'd have no clue what you were talking about. These questions can only be understood in relation to Petscop. Out of context, they are indistinguishable from nonsense. And so maybe the admin just didn't know how to proceed, so they Googled the problem and saw that CAPTCHA can be used to combat spam. That's an entirely plausible scenario. Still though, this whole confluence of events has really got me thinking. This issue of being able to determine whether or not the party you're communicating with is in fact human, that is to say, intelligent, sentient, a conscious being, or what have you, well, that's the very same issue Paul comes across in Petscop. More on that later. For now, it would suffice to say that, at this point, we the viewers have been confronted with the possibility that this website might be connected in some way to the project. And in response to a barrage of messages via their contact page, the admin of the website has installed a CAPTCHA program, a test used specifically to determine if the user is a human. I can't help but think there's some kind of thematic connection here, but I want to be as transparent as possible about my thought process. It could be that the nature of Petscop is such that broad connections are inevitable in relation to certain events or other pieces of media. And it's entirely possible that confirmation bias and motivated reasoning are playing a critical role in my understanding of these events. This is especially salient in relation to what happens next in the sequence of events. Shortly after this whole ordeal with the website, a new portion of text was added to the YouTube channel description. For now, there is nothing to do. We are patiently waiting for Paul. When the time comes, we will turn on the light. Note that this text has replaced the very last portion of the description, which previously read, "Please enjoy the recordings." We do. Let's attempt to make sense of this new portion of the channel description, specifically in relation to this whole website issue. Some people think that the new portion of the description is a case of the creators reaching out to fans, in effect breaking the fourth wall in order to relay a message that would seem to indicate that the website in question is not, in fact, related to the project. So this would seem to be an attempt to get certain fans to stop pestering the website's owner. I think it's safe to say that this is the predominant view at this point. And this is a reasonable, straightforward interpretation of the updated description. The work does seem to be signaling to viewers that there's nothing to do on our end. Fair enough. But keep in mind, if that's the case, this message is occurring at the level of subtext. As far as we, the viewers, know, this description is being written by characters in the fictional universe of Petscop. It is not directly from the creators themselves. So everything must be contextualized through the lens of this fictional story. This new portion of the channel description must also be justified within the context of the narrative. So what can we gather based on this new information? For starters, this new update would appear to confirm that Paul is not in control of the YouTube channel, since Paul is actually being referenced in the description itself. The proprietors are waiting for Paul. The author of the description claims that they will, quote, turn on the light when Paul returns. This is interesting when you consider the fact that Paul's avatar serves as a source of light in the darkened portions of the game itself. And as previously noted, the profile picture was changed shortly after the 10th video was uploaded. It was changed to a darkened portion of the tunnel that appears in the level beneath the Newmaker plane. Perhaps upon Paul's return, this act of turning on the light will entail yet another change to the profile picture. Perhaps Paul's avatar will return. Based on the information available, I have some ideas as to if or when that might happen, but at this point, it's worth asking, if Paul does return, will he be the same Paul that we are currently familiar with, or will he be changed in some significant way? Let's also consider the possibility that the proprietors of this channel are not exactly the most reliable sources of information. After all, we know they're keeping things from us, and there is sort of a menacing tone to their various updates. It seems to me that we're getting a very skewed picture of what's happening from these recent updates. Just something to keep in mind as we attempt to piece this puzzle together. On to another topic. There's a bit of contention amongst fans about whether or not Petscop is a web series or an alternate reality game, ARG for short. Put simply, an ARG hinges upon and is, in some sense, defined by a special kind of interplay between the work and its audience. As such, viewers become participants in the work. Their actions cause the story to progress. Now, there is some textual evidence to support this idea that Petscop is an ARG. Take, for instance, the fact that a website is referenced on the note in the very first video. If no such website exists, I have a hard time justifying why exactly a website is even mentioned in the first place. It seems to me like a superfluous detail if there is no such website. It almost seems as though Petscop is trying to incept viewers with the notion that supplemental material exists outside of the videos. In other words, perhaps the work is giving mixed signals with respect to whether or not it is an ARG. But why would it do that? Well, I'm increasingly convinced that Petscop is not exactly an ARG, not in the traditional sense that it relies on audience participation in order to progress. Rather, it works as a meta-commentary on the ARG as a genre in the new digital landscape. A genre that is, for better or worse, shaped by users on the internet. The distinction is important for the purposes of this discussion, and I would be severely lacking in my duties as your host if I did not stop right here to point out a stark parallel. This is a parallel that occurs regardless of your position on the whole aforementioned website controversy. At a certain point during the gameplay, Paul speculates that the game is attempting to give the impression that it is inhabited by some sort of entity.
This game is trying very hard to make it seem like there's an entity in it. Like a ghost or an AI trying to communicate with me. It's interesting, but the way you know that there's a ghost in a game trying to communicate with you is if it comes out. If it stops being distant and it comes out and you can have a real-time back and forth with it. And it stops being so one way. Like I leave my PlayStation and
The conundrum Paul faces when he is confronted with the idea that there is some kind of entity in the game itself is formally identical to the conundrum we, the audience, face in relation to this question of whether or not this series is an ARG. We're trying to discern whether this work is, in fact, a web series, a work fundamentally lacking in interaction with the audience, or a so-called ARG, a medium contingent upon interaction with participants. In both cases, the relevant question is rooted in this issue of interplay, a real-time back and forth, as Paul says. And personally, the debate over whether or not Petscop is an ARG is far more interesting to me than the answer itself. I previously mentioned that certain elements in Petscop, the work itself, are inherently ambiguous. That is, a degree of ambiguity is built into the series. It's cooked into the bread, so to speak. Petscop creates confusion and disagreement amongst the audience about very basic, essential elements of the work. I'd like to make the case that this divisive quality is by virtue of the work's design. This is not a claim about the creator's intentions. I'm not in their head, and I can't know what they expected to come from this project. This is an argument about what the work is doing. And the one thing that is clear to me about Petscop is that nothing is clear. No work would provoke such disagreement if it were, in fact, clear-cut and easy to understand. Having said that, I do think that these ambiguous elements work in service of something larger. And hopefully I can speak to that with some clarity in the following segment. When it comes to a work like Petscop, what is not said is often as important to the understanding of the work as what is said. Indeed, much of the horror of the series comes from what is implied rather than what is outright stated. So, for example, let's talk about this Candace Newmaker thing. Quite a few people dismiss the Newmaker reference on the basis that the event occurred in the year 2000, while the game purportedly came out in 1997, 3 years prior to the rebirthing incident. Okay, so here's a good example of maybe a failure in communication on my part. To be clear, I never made the claim that the Candace Newmaker story connects to the Petscop series in terms of the actual canon of the story. Others have made that claim and have further attempted to form somewhat monolithic theories about Newmaker's story and the rebirthing process in connection to Petscop. And that's something I reject. At this point, I think any claim of that nature is rooted in a failure to interrogate the work itself in a critical way. This desire to think of the work as a cohesive allegory in the same way that, say, Orwell's Animal Farm is an allegory for the Russian Revolution of 1917 is, I think, not a fruitful venture in this case. I don't think Petscop is that on the nose. The Newmaker reference is an illusion, one of many, that connects to the general theme, the abuse and mistreatment of children. But in terms of illusions, the Newmaker story is about as conspicuous as it gets. The work is clearly making a reference to the Newmaker incident. I made the case for that in my second video. And if your goal is to make sense of the work, I think you have to properly account for why it is that the story of Candace Newmaker is referenced. Any theoretical account of Petscop should explain what function that reference serves. You can't entirely rule it out on the basis that it isn't consistent with the timeline. By doing so, you're conflating the continuity of the story with the elusive qualities of the work, qualities which hint at a broader thematic significance. That's a mistake, especially with regards to a work like Petscop, where, again, much of the discomfort and even horror of this work lies in the subtext, which rests precisely in what is not said, as opposed to what is outright stated. See, another great thing about art is that it is able to convey deep, resonant aspects of humanity that are often difficult, if not impossible, to talk about in the course of everyday conversation. Rainer Marie Rilke talks about this very issue in Letters to a Young Poet. In the course of offering some guidance to an aspiring poet, Rilke says, "Things aren't all so tangible and sayable as people would usually have us believe. Most experiences are unsayable. They happen in a space that no word has ever entered. And more unsayable than all other things are works of art. Those mysterious existences whose life endures beside our own small, transitory life." I believe that's particularly relevant with respect to a work like Petscop, which is in some sense ambiguous and perhaps even indefinable with respect to its genre and form. I believe there's a very good reason for this. The series has an extremely ambitious scope. It is formally intangible precisely because of the subject matter it is attempting to interrogate. It's attempting to unpack a topic that is extremely difficult to discuss, a topic that I've mentioned in previous videos, the abuse and mistreatment of children. And one of the reasons for this is that sometimes words are simply not sufficient to convey the depth of certain human experiences. That is to say, certain emotional experiences. Art has a power that words do not. To demonstrate my point, let's talk about one specific example. I think the case can be made that the removal of eyebrows in the series has a kind of metaphorical significance, one which speaks to an overarching theme that I've mentioned more than a few times at this point. I contend that the removal of eyebrows represents the act of abuse and the subsequent anguish, confusion, and despair that comes as a result of said abuse. If we look at the various combination of faces on the painting, much of the expressive quality of the face patterns comes specifically from the eyebrows. As such, the removal of this element goes hand in hand with the removal of their expressive quality, the soul, if you will, of the pattern itself. It should come as no surprise, then, that when Paul first enters the face associated with the character known as Care, a face pattern that notably does not contain eyebrows, the game generates a room devoid of color. Just as the face pattern has lost a certain expressive quality, so too has the color literally been drained from the character's room. I believe this is a result of some nefarious, unspeakable act. It is perhaps that very act that Rainer references in his note. With an eye towards the subtext of the work, it's also worth mentioning a few other observations. For instance, the game refers to these collectibles that Paul picks up as pieces. That word has various connotations depending on the context. Since the word puzzle has been introduced in the game, one might get the impression that the pieces are really small parts of a larger puzzle. But it is worth noting that there are other contexts in which this term piece is used, such as, for instance, a piece of evidence of, say, a terrible crime. Perhaps the incidents referenced in Rainer's note. Now, these two usages of the word are not mutually exclusive. In this case, they may actually work in conjunction with one another. Onto another topic regarding the subtext. I have a certain very specific interpretation of the word Garalina. I previously mentioned that the logo looks like a fishhook. Moreover, when we zoom out and view the entirety of the logo, it should be noted that the G in Garalina is elongated in a peculiar way. In consideration of the aforementioned hook shape, I would like to make the case that the G here calls to mind a sinker. As you might guess, based on its name, a sinker is a weight used to sink a fishing line. Well, it just so happens that the word gara stems from the Latin garum, a word that originates from the ancient Greek word garon, meaning the fish whose intestines were originally used in the condiment's production. So that's interesting given the circumstances. It's also quite interesting that the word lina just so happens to stem from the Latin word linum, which has several meanings depending on the context. One of the definitions is rope, line, thread, string, or cord. So we've got a word with a fishy connotation, and another word that could potentially translate to line. And in the logo itself, we've got a hook and a sinker. It would be an understatement to say that there seems to be a recurring theme here. Hook, line, sinker. There are numerous other instances in which we can observe the grim and distinctive subtext of Petscop. I've pointed out quite a few throughout my analysis. What exactly are these sinister elements working towards? I would argue that the series is, in part, an ominous framing of life subject to the constraints imposed by the totality of one's own environment. In this case, an environment bursting at the seams with nefarious elements and malicious actors. And the consequences of these environmental factors are never more apparent than in the case of a child. With this in mind, I don't think it's any coincidence that one of the central characters in the game is a child named Care, a word synonymous with personal interest and concern. When the prompt reads, "Care left the room," it can be thought of as a kind of foreshadowing of what is to come through the game's machinations, a systemic removal of compassion or even consideration for certain individuals. In this way, Care is a kind of literalization of human empathy, and her distinct absence towards the beginning of the series is spelling out Paul's fate. That is, his empathy is gradually going to be conditioned out of him. Moreover, Care's various iterations represent the cruel process of dehumanization that occurs through continual abuse and, moreover, a system that works to perpetuate such abuse. It is quite literally charted out for us. Care's emotional state appears to be tied to a binary framework, vis-a-vis the petals on the flower. He loves me not. Care A or Care B. This dichotomy seems to work towards a state of existential despair, represented by the letters NLM. Nobody loves me. I believe it is the binary framework itself that, in part, causes this state of despair. Now, let's talk about the setting. And by that, I mean let's talk about the various levels of the game. I believe that the gift plane, the Newmaker plane, and the lower level, each of these parts represent a distinct state of being. Now, it is widely speculated that the gift plane represents heaven. I'm skeptical of this claim for a few reasons. Primarily, the mechanics of the game are such that Paul must deceive these pets in order to catch them. And to me, there's something inherently perverse about this. If we consider this term heaven an ideal state of existence, it would be somewhat problematic to say that deception is a component of it in any capacity. But maybe that's the point here. Maybe the gift plane represents childhood, or rather, the rose-colored lens through which children are shown the world. It is a worldview that is necessarily predicated on deception. I'll discuss this issue a little more in the following segment about censorship. At this point, it would suffice to say that childhood is a time when certain concepts are drilled into our heads. Notions about what is right and what is wrong, what is normal and what is abnormal. Contrarily, the level below the Newmaker plane is a state of existence occupied by jaded and perhaps even traumatized adults. It is a space in which terrible things have become, in some sense, normalized. The conditions in this portion of the game allow for one to be complicit in a kind of horrific, institutionalized violence. This is represented by the so-called child library, which only accepts people. This process of normalization is, at a certain point, exemplified by Paul. He willingly complies with the process by leaving care at the ominously named child library. And yes, he does immediately come back to get her. Presumably, Paul's just trying to see exactly how this game mechanic works. It's all in service of his pursuit for knowledge. It is certainly not a coincidence that even care and the level below the Newmaker plane are intimately connected with one another in unseen and complicated ways. This is because what occurs in childhood echoes into adulthood. Yet there are still unknown spaces in this portion of the game, and likewise there are glaring questions for which adults still do not have the answer. The tunnel from which cars speed out represents death, the unknown. Paul can't see what's beyond the tunnel. This is further reiterated by one of the loading screens. It depicts the tunnel, but there is a critical distinction here. This time, it's engrossed in a blinding light, the kind of light that one might associate with death itself. After all, what's that phrase, go into the light? It is said of a certain someone in the game that, after an apparently traumatic event, they, quote, wander the Newmaker plane. What is this place? I think I have a general idea. The Newmaker plane is the state of being lost in every sense of the word. Again, it is a state of existential despair represented by the character Care NLM. It shouldn't be a particularly controversial claim that socioeconomic factors are at play here. If we regard children as a demographic, it is almost something of a truism that they are the most marginalized group in the history of human civilization. Children, for the most part, have no agency in any given situation. As such, they often suffer the brunt of life's various miseries. Children are disproportionately affected by such miseries. For instance, children in the US are subject to physical violence more often than adults. And something like 450 children a year are murdered by their own parents. Moreover, children who experience abuse and live to see adulthood often end up with problems later in life, including, but not limited to, mental illness, drug addiction, and problems forming meaningful relationships with others. Children have no experience, and as such, no frame of reference. Petscop artfully mimics this state of unknowing. I'd like to put forth the idea that the reason everything is so confusing in this series is because this is how the world would appear to a child who has been subject to the machinations of both abusive individuals and a system that allows the abuse to continue. In a way, the series is trying to recreate this state of anxiety and disorientation that comes along with such mistreatment. Is there a way out of this despair, or is it totally hopeless? It is perhaps by going through the mythical Newmaker plane, experiencing all the pain and anguish life has to offer, that one can come through the other end with a new perspective. If, that is, one makes it out with any semblance of sanity. Sadly, this is often not the case. But I do think an alternative to this dismal situation is implied here. And this is perhaps a perspective rooted in concern for how one's actions and ideology influence the world. More on this later. When you think of the series as an attempt to illuminate the lived experience of an abused or neglected child, one subject to a system that makes no sense to them, a number of previously confusing aspects about the series begin to make some sense. Let's consider the censored objects. I have previously established that they are a plot device used to heighten the viewing experience, but they have another function as well. It is very striking that a number of these objects, present with a sticker on it, something written on a chalkboard, seem to relate in a cursory sort of way to childhood. In my very first video, I stated that narratives are important because they help us make sense of the world around us. But what happens when those stories are purposefully obfuscated? How might that make the viewer feel? Well, you might feel sad, confused, or just angry. Probably all of the above. And how might a child perceive the world when things aren't quite adding up? When they know they are being shielded from certain information? Information that might just allow them to make some semblance of a coherent narrative out of their experience. The act of censorship demonstrates a certain power dynamic between the party carrying out the censorship and the party that is said to be shielded from this information. In the case of the proprietors, a power dynamic is made apparent at the very moment the censors are introduced in the series. Prior to this, no such dynamic is discernible. Yes, there are minor edits made to the footage, but they all seem to be done for the sake of the viewer's convenience. However, once these censors are introduced, so too is an element of suspicion. The proprietors of the YouTube channel know something that we, the viewers, don't. As such, the relationship between the audience and the proprietors has fundamentally shifted. In our own society, this dynamic takes shape in myriad ways, and it is perhaps never more apparent than when it is displayed between a parent and a child. In his Letters to a Young Poet, Rilke talks a lot about solitude, and in one passage, he relates a certain state of solitude to childhood itself. And it has a lot to do with the relationship dynamic between parents and children. Rilke says, "What is necessary, after all, is only this, solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours. That is what you must be able to attain, to be solitary as you were when you were a child, when the grown-ups walked around involved with matters that seemed large and important because they looked so busy, and because you didn't understand a thing about what they were doing." Rilke praises this state of unknowing, this solitude that comes along with being a kid. Information, or lack thereof, is a driving factor in this kind of isolation. Conversely, Rilke frames matters of adulthood as largely frivolous. Adults look busy, but that doesn't necessarily mean what they're doing is important. And extending beyond the scope of Rilke's letter, it doesn't always mean what they're doing is right. I think this framing of childhood is particularly relevant in relation to Petscop. Children tend to be given a narrow, generalized view of the world from their parents or guardians. Kids are consciously shielded from the harsh truths of the world, and I'm using the term truth with some hesitation here because said truths are often contingent upon certain loaded tensions in the way societies operate. But there's actually no sense in which these said truths exist outside of this context. Nonetheless, this perpetual censoring of language and information is often justified by saying that it is necessary in order to protect the children. And that's probably true in a lot of cases. We can think of growing up as a process by which these harsh truths are gradually made apparent. Eventually, kids learn about death, and a part of their childhood casually disappears into the past. But it should be noted that this dynamic hinges upon benevolent adults, and it is unfortunately the case that not all adults are benevolent. Recall this line from the note in Care's room. Care isn't growing eyebrows. You say, that's a puzzle. That line is menacing, isn't it? Why? Because the subject already knows the reason for Care's eyebrows not growing. They're playing dumb. Remember, they are, quote, secretly very excited to hear this news. Censorship is not always a matter of protection for the person who is barred from access to information. Sometimes it is a matter of protection for the party that determines what is appropriate for consumption and, perhaps more importantly, what isn't. Many have theorized along these lines in relation to the convention of censorship in this fictional world of Petscop, i.e., that the censors exist to hide certain incriminating tidbits of information. I have previously speculated that perhaps the censored items contain information that would identify Paul. However, in consideration of the apparent fact that Paul is not one of the proprietors of the YouTube channel, we have to consider the possibility that the censors do not work to protect Paul's privacy, but rather to conceal evidence of a certain heinous crime carried out by these proprietors. What could they be hiding? Upon catching the pet known as Care NLM, the game suggests to Paul that he has the ability to, quote, turn Care NLM into Care A and, quote, close the loop. What does this mean exactly? One of the most interesting things about the work is the idea that time, as presented in Petscop, is a loop, a self-perpetuating cycle. And likewise, patterns of abuse are thought to be cyclical in nature. In fact, some research indicates that about 1/3 of people who are neglected or abused as children will go on to subject their own children to such experiences. The process by which the abused become the abuser is a central concern of the work. I believe that Paul is just one such case study. As previously noted, Paul is driven forward by compulsion for meaning. It is the compulsion that prevents him from sensing an underlying moral significance to his actions in the game itself. He too is missing the forest for the trees. It was Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you." Think about this line in relation to Paul. Recall the event that followed from his transformation into the so-called shadow monster man. He subsequently deposited Care into the, quote, child library, an institution that only accepts people. What is truly monstrous in this game is the protagonist's gradual degradation, which comes through a process of manipulation and conditioning. It's a process that leads him to lose his sense of empathy. When Paul deposits Care at the child library, he is demonstrating a symbolic loss of empathy. This is all in service of progressing forward in the game. Paul doesn't act as though he cares about the potential suffering that occurs behind the scenes. And to be completely fair, why would he? After all, it's not real. It's just a game. Paul's underlying skepticism with respect to the game's supernatural element prevents him from caring about the consequences of his actions. Yet, Paul does seem to care about progress, and he really seems to care about answers. The amount of time he has devoted to the game alone is an indication of that. So, in some respects, Paul treats the game as real, and in other respects, he utterly disregards its realness, even when it's jumping right out in front of him. Keep in mind that Paul has ignored certain warning signs in the past. This loss of empathy can be thought of as a loss of Paul's essential humanity. To appropriate a bit of imagery from the work, he too is losing his eyebrows. And as such, Paul's presence in the series gradually diminishes as the story progresses. He speaks less and less. He only emotes when the game forms a direct connection with him personally. At one point, the game asks, "What month is it, anyway? What year is it?" The years referenced in the game seem to suggest a series of generational divides. The note in Care's room mentions the year 1977, and the copyright year from the game itself is 1997. That's a 20-year difference. And I certainly don't think it's a coincidence that this series of videos was released in 2017. So that's a total of 40 years after the year 1977 and 20 years after 1997. Rayner alludes to a person's disappearance in 1977. And according to the proprietors of the website, Rayner himself disappeared in June 1997 and 2000, whatever that means. And now it would seem that Paul himself has disappeared in the year 2017. So there's a distinct pattern emerging here. The game could well be haunted, but perhaps not in a supernatural sense. In light of recent findings, it is perhaps even possible that Rayner has somehow integrated his consciousness into the game itself. Whatever the case, it is increasingly clear to me that Petscop, the game, is an elaborate kind of trap. The puzzles presented in the game are mere facsimiles of puzzles, designed to string the player along. The real puzzle is the process by which one reaches the following conclusion. The essential effect of playing the game is to fundamentally corrupt the player. As such, the game is rigged. The player is not gaming the system. On the contrary, the player is being played by the game itself. And by virtue of the game's design, one certain end is met. I suspect this Rayner was on a mission to confront his abusers, but he needed a way to ensnare them. Thus, Petscop, the game, a sort of enticing series of puzzles. As such, the game is haunted, in a way, by the pain and suffering experienced by this Rainer. Pain and suffering that he now wishes to inflict on his abusers. The real tragedy of the story is that Paul has been ensnared by a trap that wasn't necessarily set for him. Or was it? Perhaps it is indeed a trap set for all of us, in a way. Recall the note that accompanied the game, the one that said, "For you." Now, further recall the series of notes presented in the game, the ones that associate Paul, the player, with this hypothetical you. Paul doesn't believe the note could be referring to him. He immediately rules that out as a possibility. But the you in this context could well be meant for him, or it could be meant for anyone playing the game. Recall the description from video 5, which states, quote, "I guess this is for all of you now." Considering the nature of these various notes, the game seems to be framing the player and, in turn, the viewer as the perpetrator of a certain heinous crime. I believe it does so in rhetorical terms so as to corrupt the player and, in turn, the viewer. Regardless, I think this loop will occur in perpetuity until some kind of intervention occurs. One needs to, quote, "close the loop," as the game suggests. This is perhaps the most difficult challenge posed by the series. What does it mean to close the loop? What does this intervention entail? The work up until this point is deafeningly silent on the matter, but it does point towards the epitome of what an intervention should look like with this whole rebirthing illusion. So, what does a successful intervention entail? I believe that Petscop, the work itself, has been advocating for the employment of critical empathy. Now, critical empathy is really just a fancy term for a sort of smart, consciously guided concern for others, rooted in the endeavor for shared feeling and understanding. The work accomplishes this stance in a number of ways. Primarily, it is through the piece's depiction of a game that gradually conditions a player, Paul, to lose his capacity for empathy. The work demonstrates to us the process by which this degradation occurs. The game works to minimize the part of Paul that is able to recognize and acknowledge the suffering of others, and moreover, take certain actions in consideration of this knowledge. I think it can be said that Petscop, the work, operates in some ways akin to an episode of The Twilight Zone. Submitted for your approval, meet Paul, a young and unsuspecting man who happens upon a maligned, potentially haunted video game. The game, through its seemingly innocuous interface, leads Paul into a world of untold pain and suffering, the likes of which he cannot begin to comprehend. And, sadly, it's a world that manipulates him into contributing to this pain and suffering, becoming the so-called shadow monster man. In Paul's case, the integral question at this point would be, is there a solution to the game? Is there a path forward here that doesn't fate Paul to some kind of spiritual loss, a perpetuation of the same horrific patterns? Or could he have perhaps done something different at the start of his experience? I suspect not, but these are questions that I simply don't have the answer to. Perhaps I am fundamentally wrong about the premises. I fully acknowledge this is possible. Nonetheless, after having reviewed the footage countless times, I'm really having trouble shaking the feeling that, by the end of video 10, our protagonist is hopelessly fucked. But is there something that we, the viewers, can take away from his experience? So, how can we go about solving the underlying contradictions in Petscop? My guess is that we don't. Not directly, at least. This is not a puzzle that is necessarily meant to be solved. Or perhaps it is not the puzzle itself that we should be trying to solve, but rather the puzzle of the puzzles. I know that sounds arbitrarily confusing, but stay with me here for a minute. We can perhaps think of Petscop as an examination of life itself, and moreover, how environment shapes ideology, and subsequently, how ideology influences one's perspective. I know this all sounds really abstract, but I think you'll find that it's quite practical when you break it down. We're born into this world without purpose or meaning, but we are given a plethora of cues by society on how to act. Likewise, the game tells Paul to catch pets. It insinuates that this is a charitable and righteous thing to do. But are these insinuations really hinting at a larger truth, or are they arbitrary? Or are they perhaps even sinister? Is there really any way of knowing? In my second video, I discussed how Paul's scientific mindset might be a little misleading in the context of trying to figure out this enigmatic video game. Is there anything all that scientific about his endeavor? Think about the moves not available to Paul just as much as the ones afforded to him. He cannot look beyond the tool and see who is precisely relaying these messages. Ostensibly, it is a leap in reason to even speculate about this possibility. There is no one beyond the tool. It's just a conceit of the game, right? Yet, as the story progresses, the possibility of some malevolent force within the game becomes increasingly plausible. You can easily see how a player might think it's a stark possibility that the game is haunted by some kind of intelligence, an entity, as Paul calls it. Once Paul allows the idea that the game contains within it some kind of sentience, once he allows for that insipid notion to creep into his mind, his credibility flies out of the window. Or rather, that's his perception of what occurs once he allows for that possibility. I mean, I think anyone in their right mind would actually be pretty understanding, considering the extremely odd circumstances. But Paul kind of prizes this idea of being scientific. This is why even when weird events take place, Paul is really quick to write them off as benign. He kind of fetishizes this notion of being a skeptic, and he does so in a somewhat idiomatic way. And he really just doesn't want to admit that he resides in just such a story. In this way, he uses skepticism as a kind of crutch, a thing to defer back to whenever his worldview is challenged. Because to think the game itself is sentient, not only sentient but methodically deceptive, this line of reasoning is both patently absurd in terms of the idea's soundness, and moreover, it employs a kind of circular logic in terms of its validity. In other words, you can use any criteria whatsoever to support it. After all, wouldn't it behoove a sentient game, one that feeds on the lost souls of children or something macabre like that? Wouldn't it behoove this game to convince Paul that it is totally lacking in that very intention? That it is, in fact, just a game? Wouldn't the game want Paul to assume that it is merely approximating the impression of sentience, rather than giving away the fact that it really is sentient? I'm not saying that's the case. I'm merely stating that the question is unanswerable, given the information we currently have. And it's easy to see how Paul might drive himself nuts thinking in this fashion. So instead of giving credence to the idea that the game is haunted or inhabited by some kind of sentience, Paul adopts what he calls a scientific approach. Little does he know that in his current predicament, this line of reasoning is also circular. It absolutely cannot be reasonably discerned what he should do in this situation based merely on the occurrences presented in the game itself. The simplest answer might just be to stop playing it and run for the damn hills. But, due to Paul's character, that is unlikely to happen. In some sense, Petscop is about the limits of what we might call a scientific mindset in a system that is maligned from the very start. And moreover, it's about the tragic folly of a protagonist whose moral framework continually fails to take into consideration the lived experiences of other people. And it is perhaps a framework that fails to even recognize the personhood of others due to certain inherent biases within the system. Paul cannot logically deduce the morality of his actions based solely on the details or the mechanics of the game. He needs both intuition and sentiment in order to do this. In other words, he needs to keep his sense of empathy intact. And yet, the game seems designed to present certain ethical quandaries as mere logical problems to be solved. Paul chases the thrill that comes with solving these logical puzzles, but he never stops to question what exactly these puzzles are leading to. Paul's tragic flaw is that he needs to satisfy his intellectual curiosity. This is not an inherently bad trait. In fact, many lives have been saved because of advances in science. But in an environment with twisted incentives, this need to satisfy his intellectual curiosity becomes a malign proposition. Ironically, Paul misses important moments in the game because of his compulsive need to move forward. The game itself takes advantage of Paul's lust for information and subsequently makes him complicit in its heinous machinations. In doing so, the game continually manipulates Paul into committing coercive and deceptive acts. But it's important to note that Paul is, in some sense, a willing accomplice. He could put down the controller at any time, or he could refuse to comply with the game's twisted logic and see what happens. But he chooses to continue playing, and he chooses to operate within the bounds of what is dictated to him by the game. He's playing the game on its own terms, and in doing so, Paul gives up a part of himself, an essential part of his humanity. I previously said that any theoretical explanation of Petscop must account for the Newmaker illusion, and it is certainly true that it is an illusion which touches upon certain underlying themes of the work. Again, the abuse and mistreatment of children. But the Newmaker illusion also raises an important question. What kind of system produces this result? In one oddly specific illusion, Petscop offers the paradox of childhood inside the capitalist framework of the United States, where broken people can be fixed for the right price. You see, rebirthing offered a type of quick fix for Candace. For the low price of about $7,000, she could essentially be born anew, all of her problems washed away in a sick, new, scientifically branded type of baptism. Of course, we know there was nothing scientific about this rebirthing therapy, yet science, the word itself, was used to lend a certain authority to this horrific practice. This is not unique. The endeavor known as eugenics, which is now largely eschewed due to its association with Nazism, was purported to be a scientific endeavor. It was a theory by which the guided evolution of humankind would purge certain imperfections and thus lead to the betterment of our species as a whole. Needless to say, it didn't go well. And again, this project really was anything but scientific in practice. But that didn't stop eugenicists from using the word science to lend a certain credibility to their horrific ideology. As noted in my second video, the therapists who carried out Candace's rebirthing were driven by an ideology rooted in what Representative Sue Merrick called junk science. They failed to acknowledge Candace's continual pleas for help. She told them she couldn't breathe, and that in and of itself was not sufficient evidence for them to stop the therapy. From an outside perspective, this is inexplicable. However, if you read up on the underlying theoretical foundations of this specific iteration of the rebirthing practice, it begins to make some amount of sense. The struggle is an essential part of the process. The point is, the theoretical foundations, the ideology by which Candace was suffocated to death, was flawed from the very start. It was an ideology that privileged the application of a certain ritual over the essential personhood of its subject. But the rebirthing therapy is only part of the story. A proper accounting for the Candace Newmaker situation must also take into consideration the socioeconomic factors that led to Candace being taken away from her parents in the first place. And it should be noted that for all her moralizing and a hand-wringing over the tragic death of Candace Newmaker, Sue Merrick, a conservative, did not advocate for the transformative kind of economic and social change that probably would have prevented Candace from being neglected and subsequently taken away from her family in the first place. Look, I'm not trying to let anyone off the hook regarding the apparent neglect that occurred, but these things don't just happen in a vacuum. In fact, poverty is linked to a host of negative outcomes and is largely considered the single best pre-incident indicator of child maltreatment, including neglect. Instead of addressing the causal factor of the problem, i.e. poverty, Merrick and her colleagues instead opted to focus on an easy political win, one that was largely symbolic and inconsequential. As stated in my second video, Congress passed a resolution that encouraged states to pass a law banning the technique known as rebirthing. But importantly, the Candace Newmaker resolution of 2002 did not outlaw rebirthing. It merely encouraged the states to do so. only 2 states, North Carolina and Colorado, have since passed laws banning the practice. Congress paid lip service to Candace's family, but distinctly failed to address the underlying systemic causes for this horrific tragedy. Any ideology that fails to center its concern around empathy towards people, that fails to respect their personhood, is bound to either be the direct cause of tragic events, such as the death of Candace Newmaker, or work in service of such causes. In order to really understand this, you have to think about the theoretical underpinnings of such ideologies. In Petscop, we're given a metaphoric framework for just such an ideology, the ideal being presented in even care with its pastel color palette and seemingly innocuous number of so-called pets. But as previously discussed, even in this place, we find the ominous harbinger of tragedy. It's evident in the signs, which subliminally indicate the gradual elimination of personhood of these so-called pets. It's evident in the fact that Paul must deceive the pet called Amber to catch her. And moreover, it is evident in the even care facility's state of emptiness. It is a social institution gone awry due to lack of resources. The Newmaker plane is the state of existential despair that follows from the realization that the world makes no sense. Bad things happen to innocent children, and the system is either complacent, helpless to stop it, or worse yet, it is complicit by virtue of creating the conditions that allow for such acts to occur regularly with minimal to no consequences. Or, even worse yet, the system is directly responsible for such acts. The Newmaker story is an allusion to the mistreatment and abuse of children as a result of a confluence between a flawed system and a maliciously flawed ideology. But it also functions as a foreshadowing element. The people who killed Newmaker were motivated by voodoo science, as Congresswoman Myrick explained. The reference functions as both an allusion and a warning. Paul can't use science to get himself out of this. Science can't tell Paul how to act in any given situation. It can only describe how things work. Moreover, science is a collective effort, and by the end of video 10, it would appear that Paul has isolated himself as a result of the game's manipulation. Yet, in video 6, he is sure to make clear to the audience that he's trying to go about things in a scientific manner. He does so by creating a new profile and observing discrepancies in the gameplay. When Paul is directed to turn the PlayStation off because it is causing someone pain, he casually ignores this warning. Paul is influenced by ideologies he doesn't even fully understand, and it causes him to lose sight of what's happening in the present moment. Paul's case is just one tragic example of what happens when one becomes utterly subsumed by the restrictive frameworks imposed by one's environment. In such a case, one inevitably falls victim to such frameworks. They are neutralized through language, through certain restrictions to their movements, and through a gradual yet all-encompassing form of conditioning. This leads to an inability to recognize nuance and, more importantly, the inherent contradictions within such frameworks. And I would contend that it is only through a serious questioning of these frameworks that we can reach such a conclusion. So, what can we take away from this? Think about your surroundings. Think about the potential blind spots you might have, and the potential suffering of people which is going unnoticed or perhaps unrepresented in society. Think critically about these things and live the questions as Rilke suggests. I'm not sure if the series is over or if more videos are yet to come. It has been suggested that the series will continue and various dates have been thrown around. Christmas seems to be an important date in the mythos of the series, and it could well be that a new video will pop up sometime in December. Or it could be that the game itself will be released. If that's the case, I want to take this opportunity to warn you, all of you, if such a game actually exists, maybe think twice about playing it. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.